The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable. This week, the Communicators has interviews from the Cable Show in Washington, D.C. We'll look at issues facing the cable industry with analyst Craig Moffett, and then learn about the Wireless Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission with Bureau Chief Ruth Milkman.
Well, we want to introduce you to Craig Moffett, who is managing partner of a group called Moffett Research. Mr. Moffett, what do you do for a living?
I cover the equities, that is the stocks of the cable companies, the satellite companies, and the telephone companies. I did it for 11 years at Sanford Bernstein, and I've just started my own firm.
How did you get into that line of business?
I was a consultant for 11 years first at the Boston Consulting Group, and I led the telecom practice there. After a short detour through running an internet business in 1999 through 2002, I went back to the telecom world and started writing about the telecom industry and the cable and satellite business.
So when you speak, do people listen?
I hope so. That's the goal. And you know, it's funny, I'm probably known better on Wall Street as a cable and satellite analyst. I still think of myself as a telecom guy, having had some 25 years in telecom now. But they're obviously two very closely related industries, and I think it helps to have a view on both of them at the same time.
So when you think about the future of the cable companies as they currently exist, what is the future?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is the cable companies are not media companies. Cable companies are infrastructure providers. That's all they are. They are the digital pipe in and out of the home. And I think for 10 years, people misunderstood, particularly on Wall Street, people misunderstood what these companies were. They thought of them as media companies that were subject to all of the vagaries of online distribution and Hulu and Netflix, and they were perceived to be old media dinosaurs. That's not what they are. They are infrastructure providers, and they have the best, most advantaged infrastructure, at least terrestrially, that exists in the vast majority of the country. The capital markets have come around to understand that view better, and the stocks have done very, very well. I think now the question is, what do you do for an encore? People understand now how good the broadband product is and how strong the digital infrastructure is. But there are genuine challenges facing the business, particularly with respect to video, that going forward the cable operators are going to have to solve.
What are some of those challenges?
It's a price problem, right? You've had in the video industry this blessing of pricing power, that is that the cable industry and the satellite industry have been able to pass along price increases to consumers, which at least from a microeconomics point of view is a blessing. But eventually it becomes a curse. You have raised prices now so much that lower income consumers are being squeezed out of the ecosystem. Meanwhile, the programmers are raising their prices, which from a distributor's point of view is an input cost, at a double-digit rate. And perversely, the rate of price increases is so large that people are being squeezed out of the ecosystem. And yet the content owners, the programmers, are responding by saying, therefore I'm getting less unit growth because I'm not expanding distribution anymore, so I have to raise prices even faster. And you're watching the ecosystem blow itself apart from the inside. Now it's in slow motion. I'm not suggesting that the ecosystem is going to collapse in a short number of years, but you're watching the foundation of the video ecosystem start to crumble.
And is the Time Warner situation an example of that, where they're having fewer customers but higher rates and making more per customer?
Well, remember, all the cable companies have been losing market share for years. What's different now is this phenomenon of cord cutting that people have been talking about for 10 years, at least empirically, didn't show up in the numbers until the second half of 2010. People started talking about it in the first half of 2003. But in 2010, there was a watershed moment that the rate of subscription growth in pay TV dropped below the rate of new household formation. Now, new household formation was already suppressed by weakness coming out of the Great Recession, but pay TV penetration growth was even lower than that, or I should say pay TV subscription growth was even lower than that. And so mathematically, you had negative penetration growth. That has only accelerated since 2010 to the point that now the pay TV universe is actually contracting in nominal terms. That is, the whole pay TV subscriber base is now contracting at a rate of about 0.3% per year. That will probably continue to accelerate even if new household formation continues to improve. And so you've got a genuine problem here that you're no longer seeing unit growth, and in fact you're seeing unit declines. The cable companies' share losses, meanwhile, are moderating a bit, but in the context of now a shrinking pie, and so their numbers really can't be expected to get much better on the video subscriber side.
And is that all because of cord cutting, of people going wireless?
Well, for the unit growth of the industry, it's cord cutting, and I would suggest it's not the way that people think of cord cutting. I think that the stereotype of the cord cutter is some 30-something master of the universe with a terrific computer and access to all the digital content in the world at their fingertips. The reality of the cord cutter is quite different. The reality of the cord cutter is a lower income American that may not even have a broadband subscription and is looking at the pay TV subscription as a necessary cost reduction. And they're switching not to the consumption of Netflix and Hulu and a bunch of online content as much as they are switching back to over-the-air broadcast TV because it's all they can afford. So you're seeing an affordability crisis, not so much a technology revolution.
So, Craig Moffett, at the end of the day, are you bullish, bearish, or neutral on cable companies?
The cable companies are really good businesses. For the first time in my experience covering them on Wall Street in 11 years, they're actually fully recognized to be good businesses. And the nature of stock picking is that it's not good enough to be good. You have to be better than people expect. And for the first time, I think expectations are more or less in line with these businesses' prospects. And at least in the aggregate, I think these stocks are probably fairly priced.
When you look at a Comcast model where they're a broadcaster, distributor, an operator, is that a model for the future for other cable companies as well?
It's not clear. The idea of vertical integration has been a pendulum that swings back and forth. And remember, Time Warner Cable was part of Time Warner Corporation, and they just unwound their vertical integration just about 5 years ago. Cablevision did the same thing and spun off its content assets in the form of AMC, and they've become a pure play. Comcast went in the other direction and vertically integrated. I still think the balance of the industry has moved more away from vertical integration than toward it. Now, there are some regulatory complexities that go along with being vertically integrated. Comcast operates under consent decree obligations that last for 5 years post the 2009 or 2010 closing of the deal. And so it's not entirely clear that right now what that vertical integration can get them. A few years from now, when those obligations sunset, it may be that we start to see some more innovative ways to put that vertical integration to work. But right now, I think most people are in the wait and see mode.
Mr. Moffett, are the Charters, the Coxes, the Bright Houses, the et ceteras ready for a wireless world? Are we ready for a wireless world?
I think it depends what you mean by a wireless world, and there's a lot of fuzziness about the term wireless. When you're using your iPad, something like 80% of the time you're probably using it via Wi-Fi. That may feel like wireless to you and me, but from an economics perspective, that's actually a wired connection. When you think about wireless in the traditional definition, which is macrocellular from an economics point of view has a very hard time competing with terrestrial broadband. And so, and remember, this is not just an issue of speeds, it's an issue of throughput, which is in techno speak, it is a function of not just the speed of the connection, but how long the connection lasts, or session duration and session frequency. Wireless networks aren't really designed for people to go on all the time and stay on all the time to do things like streaming video. And so, in fact, the world isn't moving wireless as quickly as people think. wireless devices are capturing more and more of the usage, but a surprising amount of the time those wireless devices are actually connected or tethered to wired, not wireless networks.
How closely do you follow what Congress is doing, what the FCC is doing as an analyst?
Very closely, and I think, look, the telecom industry writ large, and by that I include cable and satellite, is a tremendously capital-intensive industry, and it comes from a long history of regulation. Personally, I started working with the FCC back when I was a consultant in the late 1980s, and so I think if you come from a background where the divestiture of AT&T was a genuinely recent event, or the breakup of AT&T and the Big Bang in 1984 was a genuinely recent event, I think you have a profound appreciation for how important the rules are. Having done this for 20-something years, with a lot of that time spent in Washington, I think, yes, I have a pretty profound appreciation for the rules.
The net neutrality case currently in the courts, could that adversely affect this world, this cable world?
Absolutely, and in a perhaps counterintuitive way, I think if in fact the DC Circuit overturns the FCC and vacates the open internet order, a first reading might be that would actually be a victory for the network operators. I'm not so sure. I think the vacating the open internet order would create a void that I suspect that Google and a lot of other internet service providers would step in to try to fill. And once you create that void and you acknowledge that you don't know how it's going to be filled, it introduces a significant amount of uncertainty. I suspect the cable operators and the network operators in general would probably be better off with the status quo, the devil you know, if you will, than throwing the entire question back up in the air and waiting for it to be re-resolved, if you will.
Craig Moffett, are the Googles, Apple, Netflix, Amazon, are they positioned to take a good chunk of business away from the cable companies?
Well, I think the short answer is probably not. But remember where we started this discussion. The cable companies are not media companies, they're infrastructure providers. If you understand that they are the physical layer, that is the network layer of, or in the network parlance, the physical layer of distribution, none of those other players actually participate at the physical layer. Many people, I think, used to use the term, there are all these alternative pathways emerging into the home, and by that they would mean Hulu and Netflix and what have you. In fact, those are not alternative pathways into the home, those are alternative aggregations of content. And I think you have to be precise in thinking separately about the aggregation layer and the physical layer. The physical layer where the cable operators compete is not a layer where they see Google, that is outside of the Google Fiber project, which is still relatively small. It's not a layer where they see Google or Apple or Amazon.
What does the Aereo technology bring to this marketplace?
It remains to be seen. Technologically, I think Aereo is, you could argue, simply another way to do free over-the-air broadcast TV, although ironically it's not free. It's free to Aereo, but they're still charging customers for an experience that, at least in theory, they could get with an over-the-air antenna. Now, they add to that DVR and a lot of interesting functionality to it. It remains to be seen how the courts decide between where the Second Circuit has come out so far on Aereo and where the Ninth Circuit has come out on its peer Aereo killer, and how that those two potentially different readings will end up getting resolved, whether it has to go to the Supreme Court, will determine the legality of Aereo. But from a user experience and technology perspective, it's an interesting design, not so much because of what gets all the press about the antennas and the way that they have worked around the rules to comply with the Cablevision ruling, But I think more importantly, it's a very interesting test of consumer appetite for paying $7 or $8 a month for an online streaming version of broadcast channels that they could get free over the air for $8. Or sorry, for the cost of an antenna, I mean.
So finally, Craig Moffett, when you think about the future of TV, what comes to mind?
Well, you use the phrase "the future of TV," and I don't know whether TV is the right phrase anymore. It's the future of video consumption, and I suspect that the old adage in technology is everything changes less in 5 years and more in 10 than you would ever expect. 5 years from now, I think we're still going to be looking at a world that is dominated by the traditional pay TV packages. You know, people have waited for years to see the pay TV package blow apart, and I think in some ways that was almost, that required a willful ignorance of the economics of the ecosystem to believe that was going to happen anytime soon. It's starting to happen though. You're starting to see erosion around the edges, not through some seismic change in the business model or technology, but through the leakage of people out of the system at a very slow but accumulating rate. Over 10 years, that will be a very large audience that the programmers and the entertainment industry will have to address and have to serve. And I think you're somewhere in that 5 to 10 year range where things really start to accelerate and the traditional bundle starts to come apart.
And we've been talking with Craig Moffett, managing partner of Moffett Research. This is the Communicators on C-SPAN. And now joining us here at the Cable Show in Washington, D.C. is Ruth Milkman, who is the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau Chief at the FCC. Ms. Milkman, what do you do? What's the Wireless Bureau?
Well, I run the Wireless Bureau, which is about 200 people, and we do all the licensing of the various wireless services. So everything from your cell phone service to amateur radio, to aviation, and private land mobile services like those that are used by taxis. We oversee about 2 million licenses. So that's one of our main functions.
Are you also responsible for like cell phone tower placement and licensing of that?
We're responsible for antenna registration and for making sure that the notifications that are necessary to comply with the environmental laws and the historic preservation laws are complied with. And we also work a lot with our state and local counterparts who, as you know, have a lot to do with the zoning regulations that dictate where cell towers can be placed.
When was the Wireless Bureau created?
I think it was created in about 1995, around the time of the first PCS auctions, the first wireless auctions.
Because of today's technology, is your portfolio growing?
Certainly the size of the industry that we regulate is growing. There are now more mobile devices than there are people in the United States, and the revenues and networks and investment of the wireless industry, the commercial wireless industry, keeps growing. We also have people thinking of more and more ways to use wireless services, whether it's unlicensed devices like your Wi-Fi device or your baby monitor or anything like that.
What do you do with that unlicensed spectrum or that unlicensed wireless device? Do you have regulations at all that go with that?
Right. So I've got a counterpart, part of the FCC organization, the Office of Engineering and Technology, that is in charge of equipment authorization. And they're the ones that mostly deal with the unlicensed devices. And they make sure that the devices are certified so that they don't interfere with any other users of the spectrum.
What's one of the issues in front of the Wireless Bureau right now?
Well, Bill Lake might have mentioned this earlier, but one of the big ones is the broadcast incentive auction. So we are trying to set up an opportunity for broadcasters to turn in some of their spectrum rights if they choose to decide to channel share or to move to a different part of the spectrum. And in return get a part of the auction proceeds as we rearrange the spectrum, turn around, and sell it to the wireless companies for flexible use, which could be mobile broadband.
So what's your Bureau's part of that?
So we've got two parts of it. One is to figure out what the spectrum looks like once it's rearranged for the wireless use. So what we call this a band plan, what size, what amount of frequency, what are the geographic areas, how is it arranged? And we're also the Bureau that's responsible for auctions. So auctioning everything from paging licenses to cell phone licenses and also to FM construction permits. This will be the first time that we've ever offered money to a wireless licensee, a broadcaster, but it won't be the first time we've run a reverse auction.
Really?
Yeah, so there are two types of reverse auctions that the Commission's been looking at right now. One is in the Universal Service Fund context. It doesn't have anything to do with wireless at all, but it's a way of applying competition to make sure that we're efficiently distributing Universal Service Fund monies. So last fall, in September of 2012, we ran an auction for something we call the Mobility Fund, in which different companies, wireless companies in this case, were bidding for money for Universal Service Fund support that they would need in order to build out mobile broadband services in their communities, either to upgrade existing networks so they could provide broadband or to expand to new areas. So that's the only reverse auction we've run. The incentive auction is going to be even more complicated because we need to both run a reverse auction and allow the broadcasters to turn in spectrum rights, and then we have to run the forward auction to license out that spectrum, see how much we get.
Ruth Milkman, do you think you're on time, on schedule to do this in 2014?
So far, things are looking good. We are
even with
still,
3 commissioners?
You know, there's a lot of work that has to be done by the staff, and we're working on that right now. And then when the time comes, we'll be making recommendations to the commissioners, and they'll vote on an order.
Maybe that makes your job easier just to have 3 commissioners instead of 5.
I will not comment on that.
Less meetings, at least. What's another issue in confronting your Bureau right now?
Another thing that we're looking at is whether we can remove barriers to deployment. You mentioned cell phone towers, and of course, as more and more people use mobile broadband, we need more capacity. That means we need more spectrum, but often carriers also need to upgrade and expand their networks, whether that's building new towers or adding new equipment to existing towers or moving to smaller cell something they call small cells, that is antennas that are closer together and cover a shorter range of areas. So there are a number of things that we think we can do to make infrastructure deployment go more smoothly and more quickly. And so we're also working on a rulemaking to look at those issues.
Ruth Milkman, what's your message here to the cable show, to the cable companies? Why are you attending this show?
We are so excited at the announcement of the cable industry to do the 150 million hotspots, and I think that almost all networks these days are a combination of wireline and wireless networks, and it doesn't matter what the technology is. All these companies are out there to get good service to their customers, and that's what we're interested in as well.
You're a lawyer by training.
I am.
How did you get into the telecom field?
When I was in law school, I had worked on newspapers in high school and ran my law school newspaper, and I thought I would be interested in media issues. And I came to the FCC thinking that I wanted to work on broadcast issues at the time. This was in the early 1980s. And somebody turned me on to telecom, and I thought it was so fascinating that I kept on doing it.
Ruth Milkman, glad we had the chance to introduce you to her. She is the Bureau Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau at the FCC. Thanks for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.